Richard Hoagland. Richard Hoagland lived in Indiana, and he was the father of 2 kids. He was married for the second time to a woman named Linda Eiler. Linda described Richard as a mover and a shaker, who was always making deals and doing something. Linda and the rest of the family were sure they were living a pretty good life. They had 2 wonderful sons, Matthew, who was 9, and his brother Doug, who was 6 at the time. In fact, maybe the Hoaglands were living a pretty charmed life together. They had a huge house and exotic vacations, and all through their 11 years of marriage, they seemed to have plenty of money. That is, until 1993. On that final day when Richard called his wife from work to tell her he had to go to the hospital because he was feeling ill. He told her he had to go to the emergency room. She offered to go with him, but he told her he didn't want to wait. He proceeded to go alone, or so it seems, and then he seemingly vanished, though he did make one cryptic call to his wife an hour later. And this time he told her he wouldn't be coming back home again, saying, "I can't live like this anymore. I feel you would be better off without me." He called again at 7:30 p.m., and Linda Eiler told authorities that the sound in the background suggested he might be in an airport or a bus station. Linda was in a panic. She went on to call all of the hospitals in the area, but there was no proof he'd ever been at any of them. It was puzzling to think this was on purpose. After all, he didn't take a coat. All his belongings were still at the house. His toothbrush, his passport, he was just gone, and everything else seemed to still be there. As hard as this absence was for Linda, it was worse for the boys. His son, Matthew, later told the press that he believed his dad would be back. Linda called the police to report Richard missing, and they eventually found his car abandoned at the Indianapolis International Airport. But despite this, Richard wasn't listed as taking any flights. Did someone do something to him and dump his car there? Was Richard running away from something? Nobody was quite sure. His horrified wife, Linda, found herself being interrogated again and again by the police. They suggested that Richard was guilty of something, most likely drug trafficking, and that Linda was somehow involved. The entire situation was devastating, and she was considered a suspect in his disappearance. As bad as things seemed to be, they got worse. It turns out Richard had run up their credit cards and not paid the bills. He also forged Linda's signature in order to take out a bank loan, money that he apparently took with him when he left town, so he'd been planning this for a while. Linda would go on to file for divorce, and this would be granted in December of 1993. It was decided that Richard Hoagland had to pay a total of 26 credit cards, loans, and debts along with his wife, along with unpaid taxes and attorney's fees. Not that he was around to help with this. Turns out their house and their car payments were long overdue. He left his family drowning in debt. Family also noticed that people seemed to be watching them, and that first 6 months was the worst. They followed them around. They parked in suspicious cars right outside the house. It's possible it was the police surveilling them, Richard himself, or someone much more nefarious that Richard owed money to. They still weren't sure what Richard had been doing. Linda said she would come home from work only to discover strange cars parked nearby, and items inside her home were in strange places that they hadn't been before. Her mail showed evidence of having been steamed open and closed back up again. It was a pretty terrifying time. On February 15, 1993, Linda's father found a recording device attached to the bedroom telephone line. This was it. Linda was terrified. She declared bankruptcy. Her credit was destroyed. The house and the vehicle were foreclosed on. Linda was so afraid for all of the people that were watching her and everything that was going on that her father would rent her a home in McCordsville, Indiana, so that no one knew she was the one renting it. She was pretty clear that by then she feared for her life. She would go on to have to use church friends' addresses to drop and pick the kids up for school. It would actually be years before they started to live normally instead of every day in fear. In the summer of 1993, both boys received birthday cards from their father, with $50 inside for each child. The card read, "Maybe sometime soon we will get to see each other. I bet I won't even know you. It's been so long. Mind your mother. Bye, Dad. Not even an I love you. This would be the last thing that anyone would hear from him for the next 25 years. Linda moved on, trying her best to raise Douglas and Matthew, but it wasn't easy. It was all she could do to keep food on the table. The following decade, Richard was declared dead. Linda finally moved on. She remarried, and the boys grew into men. Then life took another turn. A man named Terry Jude Szymanski had been a commercial fisherman, but he unfortunately drowned in 1991. His nephew had decided to work on his ancestry, and while he was doing this, he discovered in 2016 that it appears someone was using his Uncle Terry's name. The nephew took it upon himself to track down the imposter in Florida. It turns out that while Linda was suffering financially under his abandonment, as well as serving as both mother and father to the boys, Richard was thriving. He lived in a nice house, he was making money, and he owned a rental property. He got his pilot's license, and he even managed to purchase his own plane. He remarried and he had a son. Richard happened to come home, and he found police in his driveway in 2016. He stuck to his grift, however. He was Terry Szymanski. He even provided Terry's social security number as proof. But it didn't hold up. Richard eventually told the police he had decided he wanted to divorce for the second time, but he didn't feel like going through the divorce itself. Instead, rather than telling his family the truth, he decided to just move on. Linda, for her part, was pretty shocked when she received a call from Pasco County Sheriff's deputies in 2016. The detectives asked Linda if Richard was her husband, and she told him he had been, but he'd gone missing. With that, the detective informed her they had just taken him into custody in Florida. It would eventually come out that Richard had fled to Florida after abandoning his family, and he rented a room from Terry Szymanski's father. He repaid the man's kindness by rummaging through his house and stealing his son's identity. He was able to obtain Terry's death certificate, and from there he applied for a birth certificate and a social security card, which eventually led to him getting a driver's license. From here on out, his life as Terry began. Linda took Richard to court, demanding back child support for the decades he was missing. She was awarded $1.8 million. Whether they will see any money is pretty unclear. Richard was living comfortably in Florida, but he ended up in divorce court, and the wife, who believes she married Terry Szymanski, was likely awarded much of their joint assets. Matthew was 35 on the day their father finally faced what he'd done in court. He told reporters that he was especially upset when he saw that his dad was wearing an outfit that looked like it had been bought at a thrift store, believing he was trying to put on a show to show that he was poor, when it was his family that knew the reality of poverty all too well. And during that time, Richard was thriving. Neither boy has any interest in having a relationship with their father. One of the sons, Doug, faced a lot of difficulty with drug addiction in the 25 years since his father left them behind. Doug said that he doesn't blame his father for the drug abuse. He does, however, believe that being abandoned emotionally damaged him. Personally, I think he's being kind. You never know what might have happened in life, but parents are supposed to send you out into the world with the best opportunities. Richard Hoagland was a failure in this. Doug sat in court that day and searched his father's face for emotion, and he found none. Not only were his first children devastated by what Richard Hoagland did, so was his third son and that boy's mother, Mary, who had no indication at all that Richard wasn't Terry Szymanski. Mary said sometimes strange hints would arise, but he always had an excuse, and that's not the kind of thing that you expect. He just managed to dismiss all of her questions. She was married to a stranger for 20 years. That son, too, found himself shocked and hurt. When asked why he did what he did, he would just say he had family issues with his wife and children from before. Matthew Hoagland thinks there's probably more to it. He thinks his father was maybe caught up with the wrong people and got in over his head in some criminal way, not that it excuses any of what he chose to do. The third son, who believed his father to be Terry, is now in his 20s. When he was asked, he said that he hasn't met his half-brothers in Indiana, but stated that his heart goes out to them. Wife number 2, Linda, did say that wife number 3, she felt bad for her, for the trauma that they were going through too, and that they had her sympathy. Richard found himself back in court for his identity theft and was sentenced to prison for 2 years. He was released in 2018, and he appears to be living in Indiana again. Linda is doing well. She remarried and has a good life now, something that Richard took away from her. It's unclear if Richard ever paid the money that was awarded to his ex-wife. Richard Hoagland was missing for 23 years, before being discovered alive and well in Florida. Thanks everybody for watching and listening. We have new episodes every Monday. Take care of yourselves and each other.